The Depths of Silence. January 17th, 1946. Nuremberg, Germany. The air in the interrogation room smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. Outside, the ancient city lay in ruins, its medieval towers reduced to skeletal fragments against a colorless winter sky. Inside, beneath the harsh glare of tungsten bulbs, a man sat motionless at a steel table. His uniform was gone now, replaced by the coarse gray fabric issued to prisoners awaiting trial. But his posture remained rigid, unmistakably military. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Hoffmann, formerly of the Kriegsmarine, aged 43, stared at the maps spread before him with eyes that had seen things no chart could ever capture. The American intelligence officer across from him, Captain Robert Dalton of Naval Intelligence, waited. He had learned patience in these sessions. The Germans who talked too quickly were usually lying. Those who hesitated, who seemed to calculate each word, they were the ones carrying truths too heavy for casual telling. Hoffmann's fingers trembled slightly as they moved across the Atlantic chart, tracing invisible lines in waters he once commanded. When he finally spoke, his English was precise, accent thick but deliberate. There were places, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, where we were forbidden to surface, where even in distress, even dying, we were ordered to remain below. We called them Sperrgebiete, prohibited zones. What we did not know, what even most U-boat commanders never understood, was why. What emerged over the following weeks would shatter Allied assumptions about German submarine warfare and reveal a secret so closely guarded that it survived the Reich's collapse almost intact. This is the story of those revelations, of forbidden waters and the men who traversed them, and of how one officer's conscience finally surfaced after years submerged in silence. The U-boat war began with optimism that bordered on euphoria. In September 1939, when Kapitän Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp sent the British liner Athenia to the bottom of the Atlantic, though this was officially denied, branded British propaganda until the truth emerged years later, the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm believed it held the key to strangling Britain's lifelines. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of the Wolfpack tactics that would terrorize Allied convoys, calculated that sinking 750,000 tons of merchant shipping per month would bring Churchill's island fortress to its knees within a year. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Britain imported nearly 60 million tons of supplies annually. Cut those arteries, and the heart of the empire would cease beating. Heinrich Hoffmann had believed those calculations. He had joined the Reichsmarine in 1922, when Germany was still forbidden submarines by the Treaty of Versailles, when training happened in secret partnerships with the Soviet Union at bases near Leningrad. He remembered the humiliation of those years, the bitterness of a navy reduced to coastal defense, forbidden the weapons that had nearly won the previous war. When Hitler repudiated Versailles in 1935 and openly began U-boat construction, Hoffmann felt not shame, but vindication. Germany would reclaim its place as a maritime power. The seas would remember German names again. By 1940, as executive officer aboard U-47, under the legendary Günther Prien, the man who had penetrated Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak, Hoffmann experienced the intoxicating early victories of the happy time. British convoys sailed with inadequate escorts. Radar was primitive. ASDIC detection was easily evaded. U-boats surfaced at night and hunted like wolves, visible only as gray shadows against darker waves. The tonnage figures climbed. 274 ships sunk in 1940, then 432 in 1941. Each success was radioed back to Naval, the U-boat headquarters in occupied France, where pins advanced across maps and champagne toasts celebrated warriors who would never taste the vintage themselves. But there were always the zones. On every patrol order, in every set of sealed instructions opened only after leaving port, certain coordinates appeared marked with red symbols. Durchfahrt verboten, passage forbidden. Auftauchen verboten, surfacing forbidden. The first time Hoffman questioned these restrictions, Prien had silenced him with a look that allowed no discussion. "Orders from BDU," he said, using the abbreviation for Befehlshaber der U-Boat, Dönitz himself. "We obey." Later, after Prien's death when U-47 vanished in March 1941 with all hands, Hoffman received his own command, U-37, and with it the same mysterious prohibitions. The zones were not random. They appeared clustered in specific regions, certain coordinates in the mid-Atlantic, sections of sea lanes off the African coast, particular approaches to the Arctic convoy routes. They were large enough to complicate patrol patterns, but not so vast as to be unworkable. What made them remarkable was their enforcement. A U-boat commander enjoyed enormous autonomy. He could disobey attack orders if tactical conditions were unfavorable, could surface when necessary for repairs or to charge batteries. But violating a prohibited zone brought immediate recall and court-martial. Hoffman knew of 3 cases. 2 commanders were stripped of rank. One, who surfaced in a restricted area to rescue his own men after a depth charge attack, was sent to the Eastern Front as a common infantry officer. He died at Stalingrad. The unspoken truth among U-boat officers was that these zones were more important to Hitler than the war itself. The tonnage war, the Atlantic convoys, even the protection of German waters, all were secondary to keeping these specific patches of ocean undisturbed. But undisturbed for what purpose? That question was never answered. Speculation was discouraged with the same severity as disobedience. The official explanation, when anyone dared request one, was operational security. The zones protected secret weapon tests, new technologies, advanced submarines operating beyond the knowledge of regular crews. Hoffman, like most officers, accepted this because acceptance was easier than doubt, and because the war offered enough immediate horrors to occupy any conscience that went searching for trouble. What the German submarine commanders expected was eventual victory through attrition. They expected Allied shipping to dwindle, escort carriers to prove insufficient, and Britain to negotiate some face-saving armistice that acknowledged German dominance of European waters. They expected their sacrifices, and the sacrifices were monumental. 30,000 men of the 40,000 who served in U-boats would die before war's end, to purchase a different world, one where Germany's technical excellence and warrior spirit rewrote the balance of power. They expected history to vindicate them. What they experienced instead was the slow, grinding reversal of every advantage they had possessed. By 1943, the tide had turned with brutal finality. Allied radar could detect surfaced submarines from miles away. Long-range aircraft covered the mid-Atlantic gap that had been the U-boat's hunting paradise. Escort carriers brought air power to every convoy. Most devastating was the breaking of the Enigma codes, though this the Germans never fully grasped during the war itself. Wolf-pack tactics that relied on radio coordination became suicide missions. U-boats that once hunted in packs now fled individually, desperately, hunted themselves by destroyers that could track them through the depths with ever-improving sonar. The second happy time, off America's east coast in early 1942, proved a brief reprieve. But by mid-war, every patrol was a roll of dice weighted toward death. Hoffman survived longer than probability suggested. U-537 completed 7 patrols between 1942 and 1944, sinking 14 ships totaling 61,000 tons. He lost 22 crew members to various actions. He watched young men, boys really, 18 and 19 years old, suffocate when depth charges ruptured the pressure hull, or burn when electrical fires consumed the oxygen they needed to breathe. He learned to sleep in his leather uniform because there was no time to dress when the alarm bells rang. He learned to distinguish the sound of a sinking ship from the sound of his own submarine's hull groaning under pressure. He learned that fear is not something you overcome but something you carry, compressed and contained like the air in the ballast tanks, always present, always waiting to escape. But through it all, the zones remained. Even as the U-boat war became a defensive struggle, Even as patrols shifted from hunting expeditions to desperate attempts to disrupt the Allied buildup for invasion, the prohibited areas stayed marked on every chart. In 1944, as Germany itself began to crumble as Allied armies advanced from east and west, as rational officers began to understand that defeat was inevitable. Still, the zones were enforced. Hoffman, by then a senior commander responsible for training new crews, had access to operational planning that revealed the full scope of the restrictions. Hundreds of square miles of ocean spread across the Atlantic and Arctic, guarded with a priority that exceeded even the protection of German naval bases. Resources that could have been used to escort supply ships or defend coastal waters were instead devoted to maintaining these invisible barriers. It was in September 1944, during a briefing at the Kriegsmarine headquarters in Kiel, that Hoffman first heard someone speak the truth aloud. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, who would later succeed Dönitz as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in the war's final days, had been reviewing patrol reports. The losses were catastrophic. 40 U-boats lost in the past 3 months alone. Von Friedeburg, a man known for his careful adherence to protocol, set down his papers and looked at the assembled officers with something like despair in his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are maintaining restrictions that serve no military purpose while our men die for lack of support. I have requested clarification from the Führer's headquarters regarding the strategic necessity of the prohibited zones. I have been informed that this is not a matter for Naval Command to question. We are to maintain the restrictions regardless of operational costs. I tell you this so you understand. We are not fighting a war any longer. We are serving a faith." The room had gone silent. No one knew what to say. To question Hitler's strategic vision was to invite suspicion, and suspicion in 1944 meant arrest by the Gestapo, or worse. But von Friedeburg's words planted a seed of doubt that no amount of propaganda could uproot. Hoffman began to pay attention differently, to note patterns he had previously ignored. The zones were not distributed according to any tactical logic. They did not protect major shipping routes or correspond to German defensive positions. Instead, they seemed almost archaeological, as if marking sites of historical rather than military significance. One zone in particular troubled him. It lay approximately 100 miles west of the Irish coast, in deep water far from any strategic target. Allied convoys did not pass through it regularly. Yet it was among the most strictly enforced prohibitions, carrying orders that any U-boat detecting unusual sonar contacts in the area was to report immediately to BDU headquarters but not investigate. Not investigate. For submariners trained to hunt anything that moved through their waters, this represented a psychological reversal that made no sense. Unless, Hoffman began to think, the prohibition was not about what might enter the zone from above, but what might emerge from below. The Reich's collapse brought chaos that made investigation impossible. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin and Western allies crossed the Rhine, the Kriegsmarine's command structure disintegrated. Orders were contradictory when they came at all. Some U-boats were ordered to continue operations, others were told to surface and surrender. A few, it was rumored, were loaded with party officials and gold bullion for escape to South America. Hoffman's final command was the simplest: scuttle U-537 in accordance with Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow Dönitz's plan to deny the U-boat fleet to the victors. On May 4, 1945, in Flensburg Harbor, Hoffman opened the seacocks and watched his submarine settle into the dark water, taking with it 3 years of his life, and secrets he thought would die with the Reich. But the Americans were thorough. Operation Deadlight, the Allied effort to capture and evaluate German submarine technology, swept up not just boats but personnel. Every surviving U-boat officer was interviewed, their knowledge cataloged, their experiences recorded. Most told the same stories of patrols and combat, of tactics and technology. Hoffman had intended to do the same. He had no particular love for the Americans, no sudden conversion to democratic ideals. He had simply been defeated, and defeated men were expected to cooperate. What changed his mind was a conversation in the POW camp at Westertimke in July 1945. An American technical officer, a naval architect before the war, was questioning German engineers about U-boat design features. He mentioned in passing that American survey ships had begun mapping the Atlantic with new sonar technology, far superior to wartime systems. They were finding wrecks, he said, hundreds of them scattered across the seabed. But they were also finding anomalies, geometric formations, regular patterns that appeared artificial but weren't consistent with known wrecks. The Germans listened politely, offering no comment. But Hoffman felt something shift in his chest, some internal compass needle swinging toward a truth he had avoided. He requested a private meeting with Allied intelligence. It took months to arrange. He was not a high-priority prisoner, not one of Donitz's inner circle or a technical specialist in advanced weapons. But persistence eventually earned him a chair across from Captain Dalton in Nuremberg, and when Hoffman began to speak about the prohibited zones, Dalton understood immediately that this was not another debriefing about Wolfpack tactics or torpedo malfunctions. This was something different, something that the victors had not known to ask about. Hoffman provided coordinates. He described the enforcement protocols, the priority given to maintaining the zones even as the war was lost. He explained the pattern. Areas of deep water, mostly in the North Atlantic but some in the Arctic, and one zone bizarrely far south in the Atlantic, nearly at the EUA equator. He handed over his personal navigation logs, kept despite regulations forbidding such records, because some part of him had always known that one day these secrets would need to be told. And he explained his theory, the one that had crystallized during his months of imprisonment and reflection. The zones, he told Dalton, were not protecting weapon tests. If that were the purpose, they would have been temporary, shifted as tests concluded and new ones began. These were permanent from 1940 until the war's end. They were not protecting German assets at all. They were concealing something that predated the Reich, perhaps predated modern Germany entirely. I believe, and I cannot prove this, I can only offer what I observed, that Hitler's naval commands were designed not to win the war, but to prevent certain discoveries that would have undermined the mythologies upon which the party was built. Dalton was skeptical, naturally. The Americans had encountered many conspiracy theories from captured Germans, elaborate fantasies designed to shift blame or obscure complicity. But Hoffman's specificity was compelling. When Allied survey ships investigated the coordinates he provided, they found what he had suggested: anomalies. Not cities of Atlantis or ancient alien technology, nothing that satisfied the wilder speculation, but traces, nonetheless, of human presence in places and depths where Orthodox history insisted no civilization had ventured. Stone tools at depths that should have been above water only during the last ice age. Pottery fragments scattered across what were now abyssal plains. Formations that were probably natural but possessed regularities that suggested otherwise. The finds were inconclusive, debated by archaeologists, dismissed by many as misidentification or contamination. But they were there, and their locations corresponded with uncanny precision to the zones that the Third Reich had guarded more jealously than its own coastline. Why this mattered to Hitler required understanding the ideology that drove him. The Nazi myth structure depended on Aryan supremacy, on a historical narrative that placed Germanic peoples at the origin of civilization itself. Any evidence suggesting that other cultures, African, Mediterranean, indigenous Atlantic peoples, had possessed advanced seafaring or engineering capabilities millennia before the Germanic tribes emerged from their forests would undermine the entire ideological architecture. Better to hide such evidence than allow it to challenge the myth. Better to lose the war than lose the story that justified it. This was what Hoffman came to believe, and what he testified to in his debriefings. He had no single piece of conclusive proof, no captured document that laid out the plan explicitly, but he had patterns, coordinates, priorities that made no military sense but perfect ideological sense. He had witnessed a regime sacrifice strategic advantage. For symbolic purity, and in that sacrifice, he recognized the true nature of the state he had served. It was not merely authoritarian or militaristic, it was mythological. A government that operated according to narrative logic rather than strategic rationality. And for men like himself who had believed they were serving a nation's interests, this realization brought not relief, but a profound shame. Throughout the interrogations, Dalton noticed that Hoffman kept a small object on the table, a piece of brass, polished smooth by handling. It was a depth gauge needle from U-537, removed before scuttling, kept as a memento or perhaps a reminder. Hoffman would turn it between his fingers while speaking, and once, when Dalton asked about it, the German officer looked at the brass sliver as if seeing it for the first time. "We measured everything by depth," Hoffman said. "How deep we could dive before the hull collapsed, how deep the convoys were protected, how deep the thermocline layer that might hide us from sonar. Depth was safety, and depth was danger. We lived in a world of vertical measurements." He set the needle on the map, pointing at one of the prohibited zones. "But we never measured what lay beneath us. We were told those depths were irrelevant, that our war was fought in the upper layers, that what rested on the bottom was geology, not history." Now I think the opposite was true. The real war, the war of ideas and origins, was always about what lay deepest, about foundations we were ordered never to examine. The Americans pressed for more. Were there U-boats that violated the zones? Were there discoveries that were actively suppressed? Hoffman could offer only fragments. A radio operator who claimed to have intercepted transmissions in an unknown language from one of the zones, dismissed as interference. A sonar technician who reported regular, almost rhythmic echoes from prohibited coordinates, told he was hearing geological processes. A submarine that vanished in a restricted area in 1942 officially lost to enemy action, though no Allied forces operated there, and whose survivors, there were rumors of survivors picked up by a Spanish fishing vessel, were never seen again. Their families told they died heroes' deaths without details. Were these suppressed discoveries or simply the paranoid imaginings of men under stress? Even Hoffman could not say with certainty. What he could document was the infrastructure of secrecy, the orders, the enforcement, the careers destroyed, for asking questions. In Nazi Germany, the apparatus of suppression was often more visible than what was being suppressed. If you wished to know what the regime feared, you did not look at what it attacked openly, but at what it forbade its own people to examine. By March 1946, Allied intelligence had compiled a substantial file on the prohibited zones. Survey missions were planned, though resources were scarce in the aftermath of war. Some zones were investigated. Most findings were inconclusive or explained by conventional geology. A few remained genuinely puzzling, but puzzles do not constitute proof. The matter was classified, filed away, occasionally revisited by researchers who found the documentation incomplete and the original witnesses, like Hoffman, reluctant to speak further once released from detention. The ocean kept its secrets, as it always had, and human interest moved on to more pressing concerns. The atomic age, the emerging Cold War, the reconstruction of Europe. Heinrich Hoffmann was released from Allied custody in 1947. He returned to Hamburg, which existed more in rubble than in buildings. He did not speak publicly about the prohibited zones. When contacted by historians or journalists in later years, he declined interviews. He worked as a translator, lived quietly, remarried after learning his first wife had died in the firebombing of Dresden. He attended no U-boat veteran reunions, joined no societies celebrating the Kriegsmarine's history. Once in 1963, a documentary filmmaker tracked him down and asked why he had come forward in 1946 with his testimony about the zones. Hoffman's answer was simple. Because I wanted someone to know that we knew we were lying, not just to the world but to ourselves. He died in 1972 at the age of 69, leaving behind a small archive of personal papers that his daughter donated to the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. Among these papers was a hand-drawn map of the Atlantic, meticulously marked with the prohibited zones as he remembered them. In the margin, in his careful script, he had written a single sentence. Wir waren Wächter über Lügen, die älter waren als unser Krieg. We were guardians of lies, older than our war. Thoughts. The story of the prohibited zones raises questions that extend beyond wartime naval tactics. It touches on the relationship between ideology and evidence, between myth-making and history. The Third Reich was not unique in suppressing information that contradicted its foundational narratives. All states do this to varying degrees. What made Nazi Germany exceptional was the systematization of suppression, the integration of censorship into military operations so thoroughly that even in the midst of existential struggle, resources were diverted to maintain ideological purity. For the men who served in U-boats, this created a particular kind of moral trap. They were not asked to commit atrocities directly, though the line between military action and atrocity blurred constantly in submarine warfare. They were asked instead to be incurious, to accept boundaries without justification, to patrol the borders of permitted knowledge as diligently as they patrolled physical territories. This was a different kind of complicity, but complicity nonetheless. Hoffman's testimony, his willingness to document what he had observed, represented not an attempt at redemption. He never claimed to deserve it, but a final refusal to continue guarding those borders. The specific contents of the prohibited zones may never be fully known. Oceanography has advanced enormously since 1945. We have mapped the seafloor with resolution that would have seemed miraculous to wartime navigators. We have found countless wrecks, ancient and modern. We have discovered hydrothermal vents and underwater mountains, ecosystems that thrive in absolute darkness, geological processes that reshape the ocean floor over millennia. If there were artifacts or anomalies in the zones Hoffman identified, they may have been buried by sediment, broken apart by seismic activity, or simply misidentified in preliminary surveys. The ocean is vast and largely indifferent to human curiosity. But the fact of the zones themselves, their enforcement and prioritization, remains documented in surviving German naval records. The orders existed. The prohibitions were real. Men died maintaining them. And this historical fact points to a truth about authoritarian regimes that applies beyond Nazi Germany. They fear questions more than enemies. An external threat can be fought with weapons and strategy. A question that undermines the regime's foundational story cannot be defeated, only suppressed, and the suppression itself requires constant vigilance, constant energy, resources diverted from rational purposes to maintain a narrative that grows more brittle with each challenge avoided. Consider the symbolic weight of the depth gauge needle that Hoffman carried. In submarine warfare, depth represented the boundary between life and death, between operating in a medium you could survive and entering pressures that would crush you. The U-boat men lived between surfaces. Too deep, and the hull collapsed. Too shallow, and the aircraft found you. Their world was one of precise measurements, of knowing exactly where the boundaries lay. Yet when it came to the most important boundaries, the intellectual and moral ones that defined what they were fighting for, they were ordered not to measure at all, to accept limits without understanding them. This created men who were technically expert, but ethically blind, who could calculate firing solutions with precision, but could not question why certain targets were forbidden, not because of strategic value, but because of ideas they were not allowed to examine. The American abundance that eventually overwhelmed German forces was not merely material, though the material disparity was crushing. It was also intellectual. Allied scientists and engineers were encouraged to question, to experiment, to revise theories when evidence demanded it. The breaking of enigma was accomplished by mathematicians who challenged conventional wisdom about unbreakable codes. Radar was developed by physicists who pursued seemingly impractical research into electromagnetic radiation. The atomic bomb emerged from theoretical physics that, pre-war Germany had dismissed as Jewish science. While German U-boat commanders patrolled the boundaries of permitted knowledge, Allied researchers were breaching those boundaries systematically, and this difference, not courage or materiel alone, determined the war's outcome. Hoffman recognized this in retrospect. In his later papers, he wrote about what he called the depth we never measured. Not physical depth, but intellectual depth. The foundational questions about purpose and justification that he and his comrades were trained not to ask. A regime that fears deep questions will eventually be defeated by societies willing to ask them, because reality has no loyalty to any ideology. The prohibited zones were tactical expressions of this fear, patches of ocean where reality might contradict myth, and therefore where reality had to be denied. But reality, unlike enemies, cannot be depth-charged into submission. It simply waits, patient and indifferent, until those who denied it are gone. In the end, what emerged from Hoffman's testimony was not a revelation that changed historical understanding, but a documentation of how thoroughly ideology can subordinate strategy. The U-boat war was lost not because of the prohibited zones specifically. They were a symptom, not a cause, but because of the mentality they represented. A military that spends more effort hiding truths than confronting them, that prioritizes myth over reality, that punishes curiosity with the same severity as cowardice, cannot ultimately prevail against opponents who are willing to see the world as it is, rather than as ideology insists it must be. This was the lesson written in the coordinates Hoffman drew on his maps, in the zones that remained prohibited even as the Reich burned, in the brass needle that measured depth but could not measure truth. The Atlantic today holds more secrets than it did in 1945. More ships rest on its floor. More history is embedded in its sediments. Technology allows us to explore depths that seemed unreachable to Hoffman and his generation. But technology does not guarantee curiosity. The willingness to ask difficult questions, to examine foundations, to challenge narratives that provide comfort or certainty. This remains a choice, not a technological inevitability. The prohibited zones are gone, dissolved with the regime that created them. But the impulse they represented, the desire to cordon off certain questions, to declare some depths off limits not for practical reasons but for ideological ones, that impulse survives in every society, waiting for conditions that allow it to impose its boundaries once more. Hoffman understood this. It was why he spoke when he did, to create a record that might serve as warning rather than revelation. He had guarded the zones for years, accepting their existence because acceptance was easier than doubt, because the war provided enough immediate challenges that deeper questions seemed indulgent. When he finally chose to document what he had participated in, it was not because he believed it would change the past, but because he understood that silence makes repetition more likely. Every generation faces the choice between comfortable myths and uncomfortable truths, between enforced boundaries and open inquiry. His testimony was a vote for truth, not because truth is always pleasant or even useful, but because reality has a way of enforcing its own boundaries eventually, and those boundaries are absolute in ways that ideology can never be. The depth gauge needle remained in his possession until his death, a small piece of brass that measured nothing anymore, but represented everything. It sits now in the Maritime Museum, labeled and displayed with other artifacts of the U-boat war. Visitors pass it without recognition, a minor piece among collections of torpedoes and periscopes and naval uniforms. But it carries its meaning nonetheless, a reminder that depth is not only physical, that the most dangerous territories are often the ones we forbid ourselves to explore, and that sometimes the greatest courage is not diving deeper into known dangers, but questioning why certain depths were declared forbidden in the first place. Heinrich Hoffmann asked those questions too late to change his own course. He documented them so that others might ask sooner before the zones close in and the pressure becomes too great to speak. That is the inheritance he left. Not answers, but the audacity of questions, preserved like a message in a bottle cast upon waters that keep their secrets but cannot keep us from seeking them.